Hey guys, today we are discussing American imperialism. And imperialism stems from the word empire. It means growing an empire, which means conquering territory. Okay, so unlike the previous, like Manifest Destiny period, where expansion was just on the North American continent, and kind of like we already owned that territory, we were just extending into it. The new Manifest Destiny would extend to islands that were heavily populated in the Caribbean Sea and the South Pacific, in parts of Latin America, pretty far from the United States, and not really seen as suitable to become territories, but very suitable to strip them of resources, and make them colonies, not like a state. So we'll get into the implications of that today. So, the idea of new manifest destiny is kind of what I just explained, and there are a few phases of imperialism. It kind of kicks off with the Spanish American War. So, we're going to get into what that means, but it's a war where America gains a lot of territory, and then it kind of gives the American government a taste of what it's like to have these colonies that you can exploit for labor and for resources. We'll get involved in Latin America thanks to the Panama Canal. President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, will be involved in this, as well as President Taft and President Wilson. So there's a few phases that we're going to go through in this lecture. So overall, we're looking at causes. Imperialism means building an empire mostly through force, a lot of military. One of the reasons that the push for empire overseas happened is because the push for empire within the bounds of what we already owned was over. The end of the frontier had come upon us. By 1890, all of those places were states. And we're getting this huge swath of immigrants coming in during this time period. This new immigration is not over. This is kind of happening in congruence with the progressive era, the end of the industrial era that we've already talked about. So the idea is that Americans believed that the U.S. had to expand their territory or they might just explode. That's just a super silly belief, a super silly way of saying we have so much population and wealth and industrial production. We need more resources to fuel our growth, and we need more space, not to spread out in, but space to strip those resources from. And obviously, we already have this experience of subjugating people for our gain. Look at the Plains Indians tribes. After the Civil War, they're pushed onto reservations. The Dawes Act is passed. There's already this history of if we want it, we're going to take it. Also, gold. Not gold, but money is kind of a motivator here. Foreign trade is important because of industrialism. Americans need new colonies to expand their markets. They need the raw resources from those colonies to then bring into America, industrialize, manufacture, and then sell back everywhere. That sounds a lot like mercantilism that we experience, that Americans experience underneath Great Britain before the Revolution. Now we're just enacting that mercantilist type economy upon colonies that we take on. History repeats itself, okay? As Americans, the economy was competing with the Industrial Revolution happening in Europe as well. So there's some people writing about these things in magazines. Remember, this is the age of journalism, and popular magazines and popular books are all focusing on the progressive era, along with taking territories in other places, imperialism. And one of those influential books was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. So by Captain Alfred Thayer, he was a sailor. He was part of the Navy, and this is in 1890. And the whole thesis of this is if you control the sea, then that's the key to world dominance and empire. And so his idea is that the U.S. should build a large navy and build defensive bases and like fuel stations for all their ships around the world, strategically placed on the ocean so that there's influence in that ocean and people are afraid because America's there and we're large and in charge. And this really influenced the annexing of Hawaii and the building of the Panama Canal to link the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, which we'll get to later in the lecture. Another really popular book at the time was 1885, Josiah Strong's Our Country. And this one is a lot more tinged with racism than the influence of Sea Power upon history, which was also tinged with racism. Our country was even worse. It advocated the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon white English speaking group of people. And it urged Americans that their religion and their democratic ideas and their language was the most dominant and it should be spread. It even uses the term backwards to describe people who aren't white and who don't speak English in these island nations that America is beginning to conquer. So it's kind of seen as the idea of social Darwinism. We have survived and become the best, and so we must civilize the rest of the backwards world. And these were popular books at the time. People bought into those things. Um, James Blaine, who had run for president and lost, he was a pretty prominent politician and now Secretary of State, advocated for Pan Americanism. So there's North America and there's South America. And James Blaine advocates this policy of like, we're their big sister, right? We should become one big America, Central, North, and South. And America, us, the United States, is kind of in charge of it all. We're kind of watching over. And while that sounds okay, like, oh, yeah, we're one big thing, we're united, really, it just guaranteed U.S. dominance in Latin America, which had a lot of resources that American industry wanted at the time. So the first Pan American Conference is held in Washington, D.C., and many Latin American countries see through the ruse, and they know that this is not an idea that's good for them. It's an idea that would exploit them. So this expansion kind of begins. The U.S. starts to become this world bully. And at the time period, it wasn't seen as a bully. It was seen as like it was justified through social Darwinism, and we're helping them, and our economy's getting better. So let's begin talking about that. Let's talk about Venezuela first. So there's a boundary dispute in 1895 between British Guyana, that's held still by Great Britain, and Venezuela, which is a free country. And this boundary had been in dispute for a long time, just countries fighting each other. But the issue becomes a really hot point when there's gold found on that boundary. So this threatens the idea of the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine is the idea that America is the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere is closed to any new conquest. Well, now the American government is afraid that the British are going to step forth and try and push Guyana's border much further to try and claim that gold. So the U.S. kind of threatens war. President Cleveland warns Britain not to take any Venezuelan territory. It violated the Monroe Doctrine, and London should just submit. Great Britain should just submit. Great Britain says the Monroe Doctrine's fake, and we all know it. We're not going to arbitrate this. If we want it, we're going to take it eventually. So eventually the results of all this is Cleveland, they mediate the issue, the border is drawn, and Great Britain really didn't have that much urge to fight anyway. Their navy was superior, but the issue is dissolved. But what is not dissolved is the idea that the U.S. felt like they won. Oh, we kept them out of Great Britain. We stopped them from fighting Venezuela. We're the big brother. We're the protector of the Western Hemisphere. So that kind of prestige of the Monroe Doctrine being enhanced is then will be applied to other places that the United States is interested in Samoa, in an area called Pago Pago, in the Pacific Islands, which we're going to talk about a little bit specifically now. So in this area in Samoa, which is now called American Samoa, because guess what? We take it. The U.S. and German navies are surrounding this area, competing for it. They nearly engage each other. They're trying to win this area in 1889. But Germany did not want to provoke the United States because the United States was building its navy and becoming a pretty large naval power. So they resolve it in a 1900 treaty that basically says America gains this many square miles of Samoa, and it will be renamed American Samoa, including the Pago Pago Bay. And Germany will receive 2 other large islands, and Great Britain, who was just like floating around trying to get some territory too. Other countries are going through this period of imperialism as well. Pick up some islands here and there. So now America has influence in South America, own some islands in the Pacific, and they're just bolstered in the idea that this is what they're supposed to do. So let's switch to Hawaii, and Hawaii is quite the saga. Since the early 19th century, America began to regard the Hawaiian Islands as like an extension of them. It's basically like California, it's just like out in the sea. It was the biggest island chain with the most like mileage, square mileage closest to America. All the other Pacific Islands are farther away. Um, American sugar planters had already like gone there and started planting sugar and pineapple, and shipping it to the United States. And they wanted annexation. Annexation means you add. They wanted to be added to the United States. Territory, state, doesn't matter. Why would they want to be added to the United States? They want the territory, but more so than that, Hawaii is still a foreign nation. And so tariffs apply to goods shipped in from Hawaii on the continental United States. So if it is annexed, then the tariff goes away. And the McKinley tariff is what is hurting these sugar planters at this point. So they want to be annexed, added to the nation to eliminate the tariff and have more free trade between Hawaii and the continental United States. But there's something in the way. Her name is Queen Laluawa Kalani. I'm going to say it again. Laluawa Kalani. And she is a Hawaiian nationalist. She is a native Hawaiian, who insisted that Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, should control Hawaii. And so white planters, mostly Americans, were upset. They didn't want this Hawaiian queen to get her way and Hawaii not be annexed. And there's a revolt. And this is called the Dole Revolt. They're led by Sanford B. Dole. And you've probably heard of Dole before, like Dole pineapples. Okay, it's that guy. They organized this successful revolt. They're openly assisted by American troops who were not authorized to be in this area. And the U.S. Minister of Honolulu, John C. Stevens, says, all right, go ahead. The military can be involved in this. And they overthrow Queen Laluakalani. And the American ambassador Stevens says, the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe. This is the golden hour for us to pluck it. So basically, we have overthrown the queen. Now annex us and make us a territory or a state. And the treaty for annexation was kind of rushed to Washington, D.C. Oh, there's the quote. Sorry, you don't have to write it down. Okay. Cleveland, however, is president. Cleveland assumed office. He refused to sign it before he wanted to investigate. So he sent some special investigators to Hawaii, and their findings indicated that the majority of Native Hawaiians did not favor annexation, and that this government set up by Sanford Dole was put on them by force. So Cleveland ordered that all the troops under the ambassador, John Stevens, be removed, and Cleveland, however, was unsuccessful in reinstating the queen, and basically Sanford Dole just runs this crazy anarchist government in Hawaii for 3 years, and it starts this huge debate. For 3 years, it's the idea of should U.S. citizens and should the government side with the U.S. sugar planters, or should they allow Hawaii to be Hawaii? And Dole, this white sugar planter, is just like, I'm in charge of Hawaii now. Here I am. I overthrew the queen. And it will spark this bigger debate of imperialism. Should we do this? Why are we doing this? What are the motives? What are the tactics behind imperialism? All right, let's talk Cuba. There's a lot of atrocities in Cuba that are being sensationalized and made up in the yellow press. And yellow press is kind of like over sensationalized news that's scandalous to try and get you to pick up a paper. So think like the National Enquirer. So this Spain, let me start over again. Spain ruled Cuba. And Cuba's sugar-based economy was run by some Americans. So there are Americans living in Cuba. And they have this reconcentration policy where the Spanish military puts masses of Cuban civilians in areas under their control called concentration camps. And the U.S. is kind of just remaining neutral and just letting their sugar planters plant sugar and just turning a blind eye to what's happening. And it is horrible, but it's sensationalized in the press, in the yellow press. So, in fact, there are Pulitzer and Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, run two newspapers, competing newspapers, and they're trying to sell more papers, right? If you want to sell more papers, you're going to put in more scandal. They send sketch artists and photographers, both of these newspapers, to Cuba and say, get me some dirty details. I'm going to print them on my paper and make a lot of money. So they attempt to outdo each other. And there's some lesser competitors, lesser newspapers involved in this too. So Hearst sends an artist, Frederick Remington, to Cuba to draw sketches and tells Frederick Remington, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. You go down to Cuba. It means you go down to Cuba. You see the dirty details that's going on. Rev it up a little bit. I'll print it in my paper. We'll start a war. Why would newspapers want to start a war? To make money. War is exciting in the beginning. And so people would buy more papers. So Pulitzer and Hearst kind of start the domino effect that will start a war in Cuba that America is involved in. So while all this is happening, there is a Cuban revolt. The Spanish in Cuba rioted to protect Spain's power. Cubans are rioting against the Spanish, and the U.S. knows that there are U.S. citizens there. So they send the battleship Maine, a big battleship, to a harbor in Cuba in 1898. And the idea was to protect and evacuate American citizens if danger occurred, while also kind of saying, we're here. Remember, we're only 90 miles away. Here's our battleship to show you that, to prove that to you. And it's initially sent as like a friendly visit. We're just trying to protect our people. It will get turned in the newspapers. So this all kind of begins with the Delone letter. Guys, this is just scandal and drama. I love Yellow Press and the scandal that happens during this time period. So 1898, February 9th, Randolph Hearst headlined a stolen letter, a sensationally headlined stolen private letter. The letter was from the Spanish ambassador in Washington. So he lives in Washington, but he's he's from Spain. His name was Dupuy de Lome. It's a letter from him in Washington back to Spain, but it was intercepted and printed in the newspaper. It's drama. It's like a reality TV show. And basically this letter said that McKinley's a horrible president. He's corrupt. Spain doesn't have faith in him, and he shouldn't be meddling around in Cuba, and he's ineffective. And this is printed in the newspaper. And U.S. public opinion is just like, screw Spain. They're horrible. They're doing bad things in Cuba. I read about it in the newspaper. And there's an uproar that forced the Ambassador Delome to resign before the U.S. said, get out of here. He resigned and got out. He knew public opinion had turned against Spain. So in 1898, something that has nothing to do with that happened, and all of a sudden, those two events are intertwined, and it's called the explosion of the USS Maine. So that battleship that was sent down there, a few days later, explodes. And everyone's like, it was him. It was the Spanish. They exploded it to get back at America. Okay. That was the sensationalized thing. 266 officers and U.S. citizens died, most of them military. And the Spanish investigate, American investigate. And basically the investigation shows that it was electrical, it was internal. But in the papers, that's not what it was. They set off a bomb. There was a mine, like an exploding mine in the ocean, that exploded it. So the American reports and newspapers in that Yellow Press claim that a submarine sunk them. And so now Americans are crying for war. The Spanish have hurt our feelings, essentially, twice in a week. Twice. And they start calling in the papers for war. And it's the best American quote ever. And people would chant this, and they were protesting, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. So remember what they did in Cuba, and let's beat them up for it, essentially, in Cuba. And that's the cry for war. So here's the Spanish-American War. And it's the Spanish-American War where the Spanish fight the Americans in Cuba, and for some reason, we're also fighting people in the Pacific Islands, and America kicks everybody's butt, and then we end up with a bunch of new forcibly taken islands. And that's the short run of it. Here's the long run of it. So basically, in the beginning, McKinley and Wall Street don't want war, right? Because it could hurt the economy, and you don't want to be a president during war. It just doesn't turn out well for most presidents, okay? Yellow Press obviously wants the war. Pulitzer and Hearst want the war because it sells papers for them. The war is declared in April 1898, 2 months after the USS Maine explosion. Okay, so essentially, while there's urged armed intervention to free the oppressed Cubans, and Congress agreed, and they declare war in April. While they're declaring war, they pass what's called the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment proclaimed to the world that when the United States won, and we're going to win, is basically what it's saying, they are going to give Cubans 100% freedom, no U.S. involvement. They're going to free them from Spanish misrule. And everyone in Europe's like, yeah, I'm sure you are. You're going to leave Cuba as soon as you win. Everyone knew that's not what's going to happen. That's why it's kind of sketchy, okay? But however, this war isn't just in Cuba. How does a war, the Spanish-American War in Cuba, spread to the Pacific Islands? Here's how it goes. Admiral Dewey is in Manila Bay, which is in the Philippines in the Pacific Islands. While the Secretary of War was away, Under-Secretary of War, like his backup, Teddy Roosevelt, cabled, that means like telegraphed, basically, cabled Commodore George Dewey, who is in charge of this military base in the Philippines in Manila Bay, and says, I know a war's going to happen before the war even happens. If a war happens in Cuba against Spain, let's start a war in the Philippines against Spain, and we'll take both their territories from both hemispheres, and the United States will win. McKinley subsequently said, yeah, I agree with that. So when war breaks out in Cuba, the American military attacks the Spanish in the Philippines as well. So this all happens in an area of the Philippines called Manila Bay in May, about a month after the war breaks out in Cuba. So the U.S. rolls in with 6 warships, beats up on Spain. A bunch of Spaniards die, and then 1 American dies, and it wasn't from Spain's firearm or attack. It was from heat stroke. Germany's like, no, you can't do this, but Dewey kind of has the upper hand here, and the U.S. takes the Philippines within 3 months. So a war that started in Cuba spread to the Philippines, and all of a sudden the U.S. owns the Philippines. Just because the Secretary of War said, the Undersecretary of War, we can get some territory out of this deal if we beat up on Spain in 2 places. So switch back, we're in the middle of the Spanish-American War. It hasn't ended yet, but the debate on Hawaii begins again. The U.S. kind of uses the pretense of, to get to the Philippines, we have to stop and refuel all our ships in Hawaii. It's called coaling stations and fuel stations to load up more coal onto our ship so that we can make it over to the Philippines. So that's the pretense, right? But underneath it all, we know they just wanted Hawaii the whole time. So Hawaii is finally annexed because we need it for the war, right? In 1898, while the Spanish-American War is going on. It's a white-dominated government in Hawaii. They're eager to be annexed, and it rushes through. It's approved by McKinley, and Hawaiians are granted U.S. citizenship, receive full territorial status in 1900, but it will take a long time before Hawaii is considered a state. Not until after World War II in 1959, much after World War II. And think, Pearl Harbor and all that happened during World War II, and Hawaii wasn't even a state. Pearl Harbor was established during this time period as a coaling station, an actual fuel station to make it to the Philippines. That's the origins of Pearl Harbor, which we know now because of the famous attack of the Japanese in World War II. Okay, so let's get back to Cuba. The U.S. will invade Cuba and Puerto Rico just because the Spanish are there and we want to take it. Okay, so the Spanish fleet kind of lands at Santiago Harbor, where they are blockaded by a more powerful America, right? We're 90 miles away. Our Navy can get there like that, and the Spanish fleet is destroyed. The invading American army took high ground. Teddy Roosevelt is there. Teddy Roosevelt he's the Undersecretary of War, led a group called the Rough Riders, the invading army. They all rode on horseback. They're pretty famous. You can Google them. And kind of just for funsies, they invade Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico is also a Spanish-owned area as well. So the U.S. sought to take the island before the war with Spain ended, hoping that in a treaty they would gain dominance in Puerto Rico. Most of the population in Puerto Rico was okay with that because the Spanish were being just as cruel there as they were in Cuba. And then it kind of all ends. I mean, it was a crazy short war. 4 months. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, is signed. It's a 4-month war. Some in the newspapers, they called it a splendid little war because very few Americans died. America just dominated, and then we get all these islands, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, in the process. So here's the treaty. Cuba is freed from Spain. And remember, we were supposed to say, like, okay, Cuba, you're free now. Teller Amendment. The U.S. also manages to get their hands on Guam in the Pacific Islands. The U.S. will gain control of Puerto Rico. And the U.S. will pay Spain $20 million and then gain the Philippines, which is like chump change. That's what the U.S. government has in its pockets. When it comes to imperialism, that's what they want. They're going to spend as much money as possible and just be like, meh, it's nothing. Okay? Remember when we spent $15 million on the Louisiana Purchase? Chump change for a government, okay? Especially now here in 1898. So we've got a dilemma here. We've got all this new territory. That's great. But there's an issue with the Philippines. And Filipino people are spelled with an F. The Philippines. Because the U.S. took Manila the day after Spain sued for peace. So it's not really the spoils of war, so we pay them for it. And McKinley has an issue. The Philippines is larger than the British Isles. There's a population of 7 million people. That's great. Technically, we didn't win it in the war. We kind of got it the day after the war ended. So should we give it back to Spain? No. Should we leave them alone? Well, now they might turn into an anarchist government, like no one's in charge. Should we leave it alone? Maybe another country will come in and take it. So the decision was we're going to take the Philippines, call it a territory, and then we'll talk about what to do with the actual Filipino people later. You notice that the Filipino people were not invited to talk about this. And that's why there is an insurrection. When I say insurrection, I mean a revolt. Okay? So the insurrection in the Philippines, the Filipinos assumed that they would be granted freedom after the war, kind of like we promised the Cubans in the Teller Amendment. The Senate kind of doesn't pass that resolution, and the Philippines become a protectorate, which isn't a territory, and it is not a state. It is an area that the United States owns and is in charge of, but the people in that area get no benefits from being owned by the United States. We're protecting them. I hope you see my sarcasm there. There's a rebellion in February 1899, a year after they are taken over by the U.S., and the rebellious leader, his name is Emilio Aguinaldo, and he's very famous in Filipino history. He declared the Philippines as independent, and there's savage fighting and more casualties than the Spanish-American War. The Filipino armies flee to the jungle. They wage this vicious, secret guerrilla warfare that American troops just aren't capable of keeping up with. So there's tons of atrocities, and Filipinos are killed in the masses. 57,000 are just massacred in this short little insurrection that lasts about 2 years. So we're going to have a big fight in American politics over whether to annex them as a territory, keep them as a protectorate, set them free, make them a state, and it just becomes a big issue. The Filipino Commission is hired in Congress to make appropriate recommendations in 1901. William Howard Taft, who will be president eventually, called the Filipinos his little brown brothers. So you can tell how he's going to treat them in discussions of how the Philippines should be handled. The U.S. does do some good things there. They institute education, public health and sanitation like sewage systems, infrastructure like bridges and canals and roads. Although the Filipinos remain very resentful, as they have the right to, because this is their territory that's been taken from them. And it takes a long time. When I say a long time, I mean 1946, a long time for the Philippines to finally gain independence. Okay, so when all this stuff is happening, especially the Spanish American War and the Hawaiian annexation issue, there's a huge debate. Who likes imperialism? Who doesn't? Who will make money from it? What are the motives? What are the tactics? And I mean, to just be honest, why is America spreading this notion of America is better? And that's how the perspective we can look back at in 2021 right now. So here's some beliefs and motives here. The Pacific Islands are stepping stones to Asia. Asian trade has been difficult to this point because of the Pacific Ocean. But if America can own little baby islands, they can go boop, 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 and go over to Asia and start trading more efficiently with Asia. There's also the idea of spreading religion and culture, like Protestant missionaries and Catholic missionaries going to these islands and civilizing these savage people. Hopefully you hear my sarcasm, okay? Businessmen obviously want to strip these places of resources and then sell goods back to them, and there's a need for raw materials. So McKinley kind of has this issue. What does he do with the Philippines? And McKinley was a man of faith, but he was quoted as saying he heard an inner voice telling him to take all the Philippines and make it his mission to Christianize them and civilize them, and seek guidance from God in that mission. So the decision of this one man now, as president, kind of guides the discussion over what to do with the Philippines. So Democrats were mostly against, tended to be anti-imperialist, especially when William Jennings Bryan, who's lost the presidential race a few times at this point. They feared that foreign issues would overshadow the progressive movement where things need to get done here. They fear that the subjugation of foreign workers would lower wages. Like, why would, kind of like outsourcing, why would we pay Americans to do this when we can outsource it to these Pacific Islands and pay them less? They're fearful of relocation of factories overseas. They are fearful that colonies would require a standing army, and that would be like farmers' sons and poor people that could be harmed in the way of that. So a lot of these anti-imperialists, they're also fearful of like exploited racial minorities and things like that, but not so much so. That wasn't a concern during this time period. They didn't have the mindset that you and I have. So the Anti-Imperialist League forms of more of these like radical Democrats. They form specifically to oppose McKinley's expansionism. The Filipinos, they're pro-Filipino independence. Filipinos wanted freedom, and annexation violated the idea of consent of the governed, right? They aren't consenting to us doing this. And that's in our founding documents. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And they were fearful that also annexation would get us entangled into Asian issues and Asian wars and things like that. So that's anti-imperialist. Pro-imperialists are like, woohoo, America, and the glory of getting territory. They also really play up possible trade profits, like we can make money from this. Natural resources that now we don't have those natural resources. We've expanded over our entire continent. We can get them from somewhere else. And then there's this like mental or like emotional kind of tinge to their argument that the U.S. needs to help the poor. And the rest of the world is poor. These countries that we're taking over is poor. We need to uplift them and teach them religion and teach them language and help them out and build things in their country, infrastructure. But the underlying motive that you and I see now in 2021 is that that's exploitation of them for profit. So the Philippines is actually annexed in 1899, and Democrats are outraged, and they're kind of like, okay, Republicans, you did this. They are your responsibility now. There's this huge insurrection going on, and you get to deal with it in the Philippines. So now that they're annexed, the idea is, do they have the rights as citizens? Are they United States citizens? And the insular cases is a series of cases that make it to the Supreme Court that kind of answer this question. How many constitutional rights do members of territories, not citizens, people living in American territories, get? And these cases appear before the Supreme Court. In 1901, there's a series of Supreme Court rulings in these insular cases that say some rights are fundamental and they apply to all American territories. However, some are just procedural and should not be imposed upon those unfamiliar with American law, and Congress will determine which is which. So basically, it justifies colonization. It says, yeah, we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the Bill of Rights and things like that. But do these people understand those things? Because we can't impose those things on them if they just don't understand them. So should they get the right to vote? Probably not. It justifies colonization without giving rights to people. So Cuba's over here like, excuse me, you said that we were going to be free once you won the war. And there's the U.S. military is in charge. There are good things that happen while the U.S. military is in charge there. There's political gains. There's some sort of government set up, major advances in finance and banking, public school systems, increasing the sugar trade and agriculture and public health, sanitation. There was a giant flu epidemic during the Spanish-American War. And like even like insect-borne diseases that happened during this time period that America kind of helps inoculate and not cure, but stop the spread of disease in Cuba. So some good things are happening there, but essentially they promised freedom. So in 1902, the U.S. withdrew their military from Cuba in honor of the Teller Amendment. All right, cool. We said we would free you. Now we're freeing you. The military is leaving. But then there's a catch. Here's the catch. Okay? The Platt Amendment. When they're leaving, the American military forces Cuba to write the Platt Amendment into their constitution. And the amendment says that Cuba must basically look to the United States if they need help. They can't look to any other country. They cannot fall victim to others. The wording of it is they bind themselves not to impair their independence by treaty or contracting a debt beyond their resources from foreign nations, besides the United States. Basically, it implies that the U.S. still has the right to control what's happening with the Cuban government in terms of their foreign policy. And it says the U.S. could send troops if they need to or they feel like they need to. And it also sets up the idea that Cuba cannot sell U.S. military bases, and the U.S. military has jurisdiction over those bases. And one of those bases is Guantanamo Bay, that is still in control by the United States in Cuba. And it's in their amendment, it's in this amendment in their constitution that says that they can't get rid of it. All right, you thought this was just in the Pacific Ocean. You're wrong. This also kind of leads to the stepping stones, the little baby islands that America uses to go boop, 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 boop. Okay, we're in Asia now. And now there's so much interest in China. So, foreign powers in China were kind of like lured by this huge Chinese market. They feel like there's a need to spread Christianity there, and the United States wants in. So in China at this time, countries kind of had what they call spheres of influence. China would let Germany trade in this city, and Spain trade in this city, and Italy trade in this city. And the United States is like, knock, knock, knock. We want to trade. We can get over here now. And the Secretary of State, John Hay, is kind of in charge of opening the door to China. That's why it's called open door policy. And his idea, it's bonkers. It's passed in the United States, and it says all spheres of influence should respect all competition. We want in, basically. Anyone should be able to trade with anyone. Please trade with us. And this wasn't well received by Europe or China. They're like, why are you passing laws in your country that have something to do with us when we're happy in our situation of spheres of influence? So the Chinese are very mad at this. It's a relatively short-lived position, but it does get America a foot in the door. Millions of Chinese are enraged over this open door policy proclamation from the United States that they're coming. And the super patriotic group of Chinese men called the Boxers just ravage a white missionary town where 200 plus missionaries and other whites living in Beijing are killed, and foreign diplomats are taken hostage, and And so a bunch of countries come together, a multinational force are brought in to put down the rebellion. Japanese troops, Russian troops, Britain, France, Germany, and U.S. 2,500 troops come in to put down this rebellion. Oh, not 2,500, sorry. 2,500 Americans are part of this total 18,000 troops coming in to put down the Boxer Rebellion. And when it's all over, the countries pay China for damages and then basically say, all right, we helped you out. We're going to trade with you however we want. And thus America has literally kicked in the door to trade with China. All right, so moving into the election of 1900, Teddy Roosevelt will be running. This is his ascendancy to the White House. This is happening at the same time as the Progressive era, okay? The Republicans nominate McKinley. He had won the Spanish-American War. He had won us all these new territories. We were put on the gold standard. There was some pretty good times. We were fixing things progressively, and Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president. The Democrats have William Jennings Bryan. He kind of has this populist party thing. Populist party's dead. He's not a big fan of the gold standard. The gold standard was working in the United States, so boo him. McKinley is elected, but then McKinley dies. Okay, so McKinley is assassinated in September 1901 by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I've looked it up a million times and I can't pronounce it still. So now Teddy Roosevelt, who was vice president, becomes the youngest president in U.S. history at that time at age 42. That will change when JFK is elected. And he pledges that he's going to carry out what McKinley always wanted. And here we go with Teddy Roosevelt. So he knows to continue this imperialist idea that McKinley wanted, the linking of the Pacific and the Atlantic is necessary. We can't go under the tip of South America anymore. And the Panama Isthmus, which means a stretch of land, a thin stretch of land between two big bodies of water, looks pretty good. But the issue is Panama is not a country. Panama is an ethnicity. The country itself is owned by Colombia, and the Panamanians don't like Colombia and don't like Colombian rule. And Teddy Roosevelt's like, I could benefit from this deal. If I help the Panamanians, then I can get my canal there, and it all works out. So there's this big Panamanian revolution, and we call it gunboat diplomacy. Show up with giant ships, intimidate them, and it kind of ends, okay? The French kind of work with the Panamanians to raise revolution. The U.S. sends big ships, and all of a sudden Panama is free from Colombia. We're not going much more into depth. This is U.S. history, not Panamanian history. So now we have to sign a treaty to end this war and get ourselves involved in the building of a canal. So the Hay-Bonnet-Varia Treaty in November of 1903 basically says that the U.S. will pay a Panama Canal company to build a canal. The canal zone will be widened, and eventually America will own the canal, even though it's built in Panama. So Teddy Roosevelt this whole time is saying, we're helping the Panamanians because it's good for them, okay? We need them to be free from the oppressive Colombians. That's not the case. Everybody knows he's a liar. He wants to build the Panama Canal. Everybody knows it, okay? And these Latin American countries are so tired of America getting involved. It's not just the countries that I've talked about. Those are the highlights. America is involved in so many Latin American countries trying to gain territory, trying to gain resources. And so the canal is finished at a whopping $400 million in 1914. And America has influence now. America will own this canal, and getting through the canal, you have to pay taxes, and those taxes pay for the canal and also go into the American government pocket, okay? The French kind of get a piece of it, but then they back out, and it's owned by America. The Panama Canal, guys, is owned by America from 1914 when it's finished to 2000. So at 85 years, America owns a canal in a foreign country and gets paid taxes from it just because we nosed our way into the deal. Okay. So let me go back real quick. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is an addition. Corollary means addition. So we've got issues. America's very interested in Latin America. We've got the Monroe Doctrine, and Germany and Great Britain already have some space in Latin America, and they're interested in expanding. Just as an example, British Guyana expanding into Venezuela. And they are bullying. One of their big expansions is debt, right? Oh, you're in debt, little Latin American country? Well, I'll give you the money. You can pay me back slowly. But then they're calling up on those debts and they're bullying those countries into paying those debts, specifically in Venezuela. So Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy idea is speak softly and carry a big stick. So first, let's go at it with diplomacy, but also I've got this giant battering ram of a military, specifically a navy, that can kick your butt if you don't do what I say. And he's threatening Germany and Great Britain, specifically in Latin America, with speak softly and carry a big stick. It's called big stick diplomacy. Okay. He called it preventative intervention, the Roosevelt corollary. And basically, it says in future financial crises in Latin America, it's America's job to bail them out. No more Europe, um, like helping them with debts. We're going to pay off their debts to Europe. We're going to have, and when you pay off someone's debt, if someone's in debt to you, it's kind of like they owe you. It's kind of like you have some control over them. We're going to take over customs in those areas. We're going to make sure nothing bad is going in or out. We're the policemen of the Caribbean Sea. We are in charge. That's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. We also have an issue that Teddy Roosevelt actually wins a Nobel Peace Prize for, the Russo-Japanese War. The United States is not all bad. We do remedy some issues here. So Russia and Japan are fighting over ports in Manchuria and Korea. Korea is its own country and China is its own country. Manchuria, China. And the U.S. is interested because we're now involved in China. We want to protect some Asian trade and protect our control over Pacific Islands. The Treaty of Portsmouth, basically they're fighting. They're fighting over a railroad. They're fighting over areas in Manchuria and China and Korea. But the U.S., Teddy Roosevelt specifically, steps in and he wants to prevent either side from gaining a monopoly in Asia. He doesn't want to be involved in the war, so he helps them sign a treaty. He mediates the agreement and wins a Nobel Peace Prize for it. So the Treaty of Portsmouth basically says that Japanese gained part of it and the Russia gained part of it. And I mean, we don't need to know that part of it. We need to know that Teddy Roosevelt said, all right, guys, we're going to solve this. But in his head, he's thinking, I'm solving this for me because I still want to trade with China. Okay. All right. The side note, this is going on because of immigration and the wave of new immigration and the imperialist like time period. Many immigrants in these territories are coming to the United States, including little Pacific islands that we have taken where they're ethnic Japanese. So in 1906, 70,000 Japanese immigrants are pouring into California as a result of dislocations, the Russo-Japanese War. They feel like America is a land of opportunity. And a bunch of people are against this. There's even the Asian Exclusion League, a bunch of nativists. Remember, Chinese Exclusion Act has already been passed and no Chinese are allowed to immigrate, but now there's all these Japanese people immigrating. And San Francisco school officials rule that Asian children should be segregated and attend a special school. And the school system is just horrible for these Asian children. So Japan is super mad and says, how dare you discriminate against ethnic Japanese people like that in your country? And some people in Japan even call for war. And of course, this is all sizzling in the yellow press, sensationalized, scandalous news, okay? Teddy Roosevelt is concerned because California, we just don't want to lose the money that California makes and all those Pacific Islands make for us. So, he coerced Californians to repeal the order in San Francisco and accept what came to be known as the Gentleman's Agreement. So the Gentleman's Agreement was the Japanese stopped the flow of laborers to the United States. So we're going to stop having as many people be immigrated, like a set amount that Japanese can come over. And then the Californians will not ban Japanese from public schools. Part of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy is the Great White Fleet. And this is his new Navy. He's spending a lot of money that the government is making from tariffs, importing things from foreign countries. He spends that money on creating a new Navy, and the sides of ships are made out of steel. They kind of look white in the sun. They glisten in the sun. He takes the Great White Fleet on a world tour, literally around the world. Not him. He joins at some stops. Basically going to people's countries and saying, look what we have. And it's not just showy like that. It's also like, if you try and come at us, we have this big giant navy. It's called the Great White Fleet. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt is president for the rest of McKinley's term. He is elected again, and there's no two-term rule at this point. He declines to continue being president after his second term. His first term was technically McKinley's. He lived it out. He did a second term. He declines to run again, and he kind of elects his vice president. He's like, that's my dude. You guys should elect Taft, William Howard Taft. And they do. And so William Howard Taft's foreign policy is called dollar diplomacy, and it's all about money and less about the military. So the idea of dollar diplomacy is to use foreign policy to protect economic interest and Wall Street and their investments abroad, make money overseas to protect our economy. So we're trying to reduce rival powers and reduce their influence, especially in Latin America, from taking advantage of the financial chaos in the Caribbean. And U.S. bankers will be strengthened through this, through all the money funneling in. And that's the gist of it. That's where we're going to stop with imperialism, because the next president would be Wilson. And we are doing a reading over Wilson and what he does as an imperialist.